Morning of the 4th of June, 1942, north of Midway Atoll, the ocean looks empty until a destroyer's wake cuts a bright scar across the swells. Wade McCluskey in an SBD from Enterprise tilts his canopy to follow it, the compass humming the fuel gauge uncomfortably low. Far ahead, four flat rectangles work against the wind. On those decks, Japanese crews under Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo rush refueling lines past stacks of armed D3As and B5Ns. The order to rearm for another strike has collided with the need to defend. Above that moving city, Zero's orbit too low, pulled down by the long punishing runs of American torpedo squadrons that have already paid in fire and foam. Chester Nimitz has placed his carriers northeast of the atoll. Raymond Spruance brings Enterprise and Hornet onto the wind, while Frank Jack Fletcher's damaged Yorktown holds station to launch again. On the Japanese side, the combined fleet under Isoroku Yamamoto sits beyond the horizon. Closer in Hiryu's rear admiral, Tamon Yamaguchi, watches the sky and measures options in seconds. The sea between them is more a clock than a map. McCluskey's dive group finds the fleet all at once. Voice circuits stay spare. No speeches. A tilt of wings, a hand signal. Then the Dauntlesses from VS6 and VB6 slide into their steep parabolas. The first carrier below Kaga fills the sight like a road. Bomb doors open. Wind screams through struts. Delayed fuses arm with a click lost in the airload. A zero flashes past too late, to claw upward to the proper altitude. The crosshatch steadies on the target line. Pilots hold through the buffet, ride the tremor, and touch the release. On Akagi, a petty officer shouts for hose crews to clear a path. Gasoline mist and loose ordnance do not care about shouts. The first American bombs walk along Kaga's deck, slicing through planking and steel into loaded hangars. Fire does not start so much as arrive. A second plume lifts from Akagi, a single precise hit in the crowded heart of the ship. On Soryu's island, an officer reaches for a voice tube, then stops as the deck heaves. Yorktown's VB3 under Maxwell Leslie has come in from another bearing and found its mark. In the space of minutes, three carriers that ruled oceans in December now carry fire deeper than any hose can reach. Enterprise planes claw back into the light engines laboring in the pullout. Richard Best glances once at Akagi's wake, twisting in orange and black, then tucks in to form up. Below deck, crews scatter and then regroup in the ritual of damage control. But the ritual is mismatched to the scale. Flames race along galleries loaded with fuel and bombs. The shipboard air smells of paint, gasoline, and hot metal, the mix every sailor knows and dreads. Helm orders ring out. Zigzags tighten. Columns smoke mark where the geometry of the battle has shifted. Yorktown turns into the wind, again battered, but still a deck that moves air. Her crew patches, ruptures shores, bulkheads, and brings steam back online between alarms. On the hangar level, men haul hoses around a torpedo patch that weeps at the seams. Above them, aircraft thump down and are struck below as if the ship were not bleeding at all. The ship's rhythm is practical, and unsentimental launch recover, repair repeat. Hiryu remains the one clear deck among the four. Yamaguchi does not wait for certainty. He sends a counterstrike that will soon find Yorktown and drives bombs and torpedoes into her plates. For a short span, the sky feels troubled again, not decided. Yet the smoke pillars to the west do not bend to command. They stand like new islands. Silence arrives late in the American cockpits as engines settle into cruise and the horizon widens. McCluskey's hunch about the destroyer's wake has become a line of wrecked flight decks. Radios crackle with short confirmations and headings. No exclamation marks, only the next vector and the fuel state. Far below, the Pacific keeps its surface without comment, while three carriers burn in parallel, and a fourth prepares to throw what it has left back into the fight. 6 months is not a legend. It is a calendar that begins on 7 December 1941 and lands on the morning north of Midway. Japan expects the opening shock to hold long enough for a decisive carrier battle to close the book. The United States refuses that script and answers with procedure. Chester Nimitz reorganizes his few flight decks into fast task forces and puts them where they can hit and still live to launch again. Raymond Spruance brings Enterprise and Hornet as a paired blade. Frank Jack Fletcher, carrying the wounded Yorktown, refuses to be absent. Across the ocean, Isoroku Yamamoto builds a trap around Midway, trusting Chuichi Nagumo's four carriers to draw the Americans out and destroy them. Both sides plan for contact. Only one side plans for the hours after contact. The first proof that the clock has changed arrives in April. James Doolittle lifts 16B, 25 seconds off Hornet, and sends them across Tokyo and other cities. The damage on the ground was minor. The strategic damage is timing. Tokyo is not beyond reach, and the combined fleet accelerates the Midway operation to restore the aura of control. In May, both sides test the new geometry in the Coral Sea. Shokaku takes heavy damage. Zuikaku's air group is mauled. Neither will be ready a month later. The United States pays Lexington and brings home a battered Yorktown. The scoreboard looks even, but the question is not points. The question is, who can repair what matters and have it on station when the next coordinates lock in? Pearl Harbor's dry docks answer. Yorktown limps in with surveyors talking weeks, Nimitz orders days. Crews in denim weld and plate through the night while logistics officers strip stores from the island for a ship that is not supposed to sail. Steam comes up. Lines are cast off. Yorktown leaves with men still working in passageways as she clears the channel. The gesture is not romantic. It is arithmetic. A third flight deck, at the point of decision, turns scouting reports into attack vectors. If she is late, Midway is a different fight. Intelligence turns timing into position. In a low building in Hawaii, codebreakers at station, HYPO read enough of the traffic to isolate Midway as the target. Nimitz does not strengthen the atoll and waits. He places carriers northeast of it to ambush the approach. The American plan is not to meet might with might, but to turn information into surprise, and surprise into a short, violent window where dive bombers can work. The Japanese plan assumes the enemy will reveal himself when Midway is threatened. The American plan assumes the enemy will reveal himself the moment he believes that. The order of battle is thin for both sides, but the differences inside the thinness matter. Japan brings Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu under Nagumo, with veteran aircrews flying A-6M0's D-3A dive bombers and B-5N torpedo planes. The Americans bring Enterprise and Hornet under Spruance and Yorktown under Fletcher, with SBD Dauntless's F-4F, Wildcats, and torpedo squadrons that will fly at wave-top height and bleed to pull combat air patrol downward. Both commands have doctrine and drills. Only one command has the cultural reflex to repair under fire as a first principle and to separate rearming cycles from hazardous deck moments once a contact report arrives. Technology sits under tactics like a keel. Radar on American ships gives earlier warning and a way to manage combat air patrol altitude. Dive bombing accuracy is married to delayed fuses that bite through planking into hangars where fuel and ordnance wait. Japanese carrier design and deck cycles favor speed of the first blow, but expose a weak seam when rearming overlaps with a sudden need to defend. On paper, zero performance outclasses the Wildcat. In practice, escort assignment and altitude control decide which airplane is in the wrong sky when the second strike arrives. The human stakes are not rhetoric. Japanese aviators have trained together for years and carry a discipline born in peacetime concentration. Their edge fades when losses cut into a cadre that cannot be replaced at wartime speed. American pilots are not yet elegant at fighter tactics, but their scout bombers drill to hold the sight through buffet and release without flourish. Torpedo crews do not volunteer to die. They fly because the scheme demands fighters be dragged low and busy. On the decks, Japanese handlers move lines of armed aircraft through tight galleries that reward speed and punish surprise. On American decks, damage control is not a bulletin. It is a language spoken without orders. Doctrine frames every decision. Kantai Kessen assumes a set piece, where an enemy fleet is drawn out and destroyed in one day. That assumption melts when the opponent reads the plan, holds the surface battle, and fights with carriers as maneuver artillery over hundreds of miles. The American side does not chase a duel. It chases a chain find with code breaking and search fix with position mass carriers for a single violent window strike once with discipline, repair, and repeat. The Japanese side fights brilliantly within the first act and leaves too much of the second act to hope that the first act will suffice. All of this funnels into the narrow hour north of Midway. The combined fleet expects the Americans to arrive late and in pieces. The Americans arrive early and on the flank. The Japanese decks are crowded with fueled aircraft when contact tightens. The American dive bombers arrive from altitude when the combat air patrol is low. The 6-month claim in the title is not a boast. It is the intersection of code-breaking repair tempo and strike discipline. Shock opened the campaign in December. By June, Shock belongs to whichever side can schedule its violence, absorb the blow that follows, and still have a flight deck turning into the wind. The technical truth of the 6-month window is written in how machines were used, not how they were advertised. The A6M2, that ranged far and climbed fast, carried almost no armor and flew with unsealed fuel tanks. Its gifts won the first swings of a fight and then created a cost when flak and fragments turned fuel mist into fire. The D3. A dive bomber placed bombs cleanly at moderate speed but lived on timing and escort. The B-5N torpedo aircraft brought a shallow-running Type 91 that was clever in water and tragically exposed during the run-in. These strengths fit a doctrine that prized the opening blow. They also assumed the enemy would not survive it, rally, and counterstrike while decks were rearming. Across the line, the SBD Dauntless was not fast, but was brutally honest under a dive. Pilots drilled to ride buffet without flinch, hold the sight through tremor, and release where steel mattered. Delayed fuses bit through deck planking and detonated in hangars where fuel lines and ordnance were staged. Wildcats did not outturn the Zero, and did not need to if altitude and escort tasking were disciplined. Radar plots on American ships pulled the combat air patrol into the right sky more often than guesswork would have allowed. None of this erased loss. It imposes sequence on chaos. Sequence is what ripped the morning open north of Midway. Before the famous 5 minutes, there was an hour of punishment that set the geometry. Torpedo crews came first and died first. From Hornet, the men of VT-8 flew in at wavetop and were cut apart by fighters and flak. From Enterprise, VT-6 pressed a similar line into the same buzzsaw. From Yorktown, VT-3 arrived later and met the pattern that kills slow aircraft in a straight line. The cost was savage and recorded in names. The effect was almost invisible unless you looked up. Zeros that should have lived high were dragged down and outward by repeated threats that commanders could not afford to ignore. Sections fractured. Altitude discipline blurted. The sky was temporarily emptied of the one thing that could stop a dive group arriving from above. The dive groups found their mark because a search leader trusted a detail. Wade McCluskey followed a destroyer's wake that looked wrong for open ocean. The wake belongs to Arashi, sprinting to rejoin after depth charging a submarine. That sprint drew an arrow across the water to the carriers. The find was not magic and not lucky in the romantic sense. It was inference under fuel margins tight enough to make the decision carry weight. Once the decks were sighted, the rest was a test of drills carried in bone. Deck and hangar practice on the Japanese side rewarded speed and punished surprise. Aircraft were fueled and armed below with lines of bombs and torpedoes staged for a second strike. Fire breaks and sprinklers were real, but sized for accidents, not for multiple hits that vented flame into galleries. When the order to rearm collided with the order to defend, time became the enemy. The moment a high threat materialized, handlers needed clear paths and clean decks, and they had neither. Every hose not yet drained, every bomb in transit, became a fuse waiting for a spark. At 1020, the spark arrived 3 times. The first Dauntlesses rolled over Kaga from altitude. Bombs walked along the flight deck and drove into hangars where armed aircraft waited. The second pattern found Akagi, and a single bomb in the crowded heart of the ship did more than a cluster would have done in a clean space. From a different bearing, Yorktown's dive bombers under Maxwell, Leslie came in on Soryu and put their charges where elevators and fuel trunks turned one detonation into a dozen problems. In the time it takes to read this paragraph, 3 carriers went from launching to burning. Survivability differences are dull to list and vivid to live. Self-sealing tanks keep a puncture from becoming a torch. Armor plate keeps fragments from turning crew spaces into fuel-lit rooms. Damage control culture is not a bulletin posted in calm. It is a habit that shortens orders and extends the life of a ship that has already lost power. American carriers had drilled to separate rearming from deck exposure, and even then, Yorktown's survival under Hiryu's counterstrike depended on crews who could bring steam back, relight, and recover aircraft while listing. Japanese carriers were built to launch fast and together, and were deadly when they did. They were less forgiving when a bomb hit during the Sloan cycle. Metrics inside that hour tell the same story without adjectives. Minutes between sighting and first impacts were counted on one hand. 3 flight decks were disabled inside the same 5-minute window. Torpedo squadrons suffer loss rates that would cripple a force if measured only in aircraft, yet their effect on combat air patrol altitude was decided for the strike that mattered. Sortie generation after the fires began, dropped not in half but to nearly zero, as elevators jammed, hoses burned, and deck crews fought for a ship rather than a schedule. On the American side, even after being struck, Yorktown recovered aircraft and then took more damage. The ship fights as a platform rather than a symbol. Hiryu remains coherent for a time because Tamon Yamaguchi refused paralysis. He launched a counterstrike that found Yorktown and put bombs and torpedoes into her. This was coordination under ruin, and it mattered. It proved the Japanese air arm could still land a clean hit when a clean deck and organized air group remained. It also showed the limits of a day that had already broken in the hangars of 3 other carriers. Hiryu was a blade swinging alone, and alone is not how carrier warfare wins. Pilots on both sides learned the same lesson from opposite angles. A D-3A driver who had been lethal over the Indian Ocean suddenly understood that a radar-warned combat air patrol at the right height is a wall, not a rumor. An SBD pilot who had trained in peacetime dives found that a bomb placed into a fuel trunk does more than shatter steel. It collapses time for the enemy. A Zero leader pulled low by torpedo runs saw the sunside sky go quiet and then explode into dark plumes where the dive paths had been invisible until the last seconds. A Wildcat escort learned again that an airplane that cannot outturn can still escort if it is where it should be, when it should be. Technical details answer the why behind each photograph of a burning deck. The Type 91's shallow running gear mattered in lagoons and roadsteads, but once torpedo aircraft faced radar-cupped fighters and dense flak without suppressive escort, their survival depended on a sequence the Americans had already broken. The Mk-13 was a sullen weapon early in the war, but its value in this hour was to exist as a reason for Zeros to be somewhere they should not be when the Dauntlesses arrived. Delayed fuses were not decorated. They were tuned to get past the surface and into the places fire cannot be contained. Elevators were not just machinery. They were chimneys when ruptured. Every one of these specifics translates into survival odds under the exact conditions that morning created. The last hard edge is training and replacement. Japanese air groups were elite and cohesive, and they paid a price for that cohesion when attrition at Coral Sea and Midway tore holes in a cadre that took years to build. American groups were mixed in skill, but swimming in a system that could absorb losses and graduate new crews at a pace the enemy could not match by mid-year. That difference did not win a morning by itself. It determines who could turn a bad hour into a better afternoon and who could not. When the smoke rose straight and high from 3 points on the horizon, the argument about aura ended for the day. The machines had done what they were designed to do. The way they were used decided which designs mattered. The numbers that will be quoted in reports are not abstract. They are the minutes between a sighting and a hit, the count of decks that stopped launching inside, that span the ratio between torpedo losses and the altitude of the enemy's fighters, the zeros, in a sortie schedule, after fire control, loses the race. The doctrine that began the war assumed the first blow would carry. The contact that morning proved the second act is where wars at sea are decided. 5 minutes of disciplined dives did what a month of aura could not. Heat shimmers ahead of the bow, and the arming wire flicks in the slipstream. The D-3A settles into its dive nose to the gray shape that fills the sight. The pilot speaks once on the set range and release line, and the gunner's reply is a calm syllable cut short by flak. He has done this overseas with no name and decks that gave way under clean hits. Here the deck loses way, regains it, and throws a proper wake again, as if the ship were insulting the bomb in midair. He holds the green dot steady, feels the buffeting climb up the control column, and presses the button. The weight lifts and his body floats for a heartbeat he no longer trusts. He pulls the nose level and shoves the throttle forward. A Wildcat passes in a slant of sunlight where briefings promised empty sky. The gunner fires a short, angry burst, not at the fighter itself, but at the moment on the chart that should have been safe. The pilot checks instruments, checks the wingman, finds only a smear of smoke and a shadow falling too fast. Fuel says he cannot circle for confirmation. He points home and accepts that the target he hit is still moving. A little earlier, an A6M division leader rides circles that are too low and knows it. Reports of incoming torpedo aircraft are not abstractions when wakes converge on a carrier's beam. He drops again to stern chase a dot and watches tracers from the deck climb past the torpedo plane before his own cannon can reach it. He kills the dot because it is there, and because duty says the low threat must be cleared. But the sun is wrong now, and the horizon holds a silence that should not exist. He pulls the throttle into the climb, and the engine notes roughens the angle. He squints into glare and cannot find the specks he expects where they must be if the world still makes sense. The alarm does not ring in his ears. It rings on the decks. Columns lift from two horizons, and then a third. He calls his wingmen to altitude and gets two voices back, a third broken into static and a fourth that never replies. The climb continues because the climb must continue, but the reason for altitude has already been written in black over the sea. Wade McCluskey flies with a smear of oil on the canopy and wipes it with the back of his glove without thinking. The destroyer's wake makes a straight mark across open blue where no straight mark should be, and he turns the group on it. A few minutes later, he has carriers under his nose. He does not make a speech. He gives the bare essentials and saves the rest for hands and wings. A pilot rolls left into a steeper path for Kaga, and the sight reticle swells until the ship is all reticle. Another holds for Akagi, a narrow, nervous drop, where a fraction of a second matters more than any training story ever said it would. Richard Best squeezes through buffet and keeps the cross where elevators and trunks meet. He feels the airplane try to dance around him and refuses to let it. The bomb falls. The world roars up instead of down. He pulls into sunlight that feels too bright for the noise below. There is always a moment in the climb when the radio is quiet and the formation counts. Names, then numbers, then a gap that means the same thing as a sentence would. Fuel calls follow. The horizon is no longer an empty problem. It is a set of black pillars that do not move with the ships. The urge to bank and look is a physical thing at the base of the neck, but the habit of the checklist is stronger. Climb check 6, form report take heading. A pilot tucked in on Best's wing glances once at the wake that used to be an ordered pattern of turns and now is a set of frantic scribbles. The next thing on his plate is airspeed, not awe. Below, Yorktown breathes like a tired animal and still lifts the wind across her deck. A petty officer leads a hose team down a passage that is newly hot, then hotter. The deck under his boots has a tilt that makes the brain insist on land, but the hands know better. He barks a word he has used 100 times, and 4 men drag the nozzle around a corner where the heat is a living thing. The paint has a smell he has learned to hate because it goes just before a flash. Someone on the sound-powered phone lays out a set of bearings in a voice so flat it could be describing groceries. Steam whistles somewhere it shouldn't. The petty officer holds the line, while a shoring crew builds a frame that will not win a beauty contest and will keep a door from bowing. Above, a plane thumps down and is pulled forward by men who have learned to run bent at the waist. He doesn't look up. He stares at a tongue of flame that wants to live in the next space and pushes it backward until the hose crinkles in his palms. There is a man in a dark room with a grease pencil and a clock. He is not the commander of anything great. He is a talker, a relay, a hinge for messages that must move at the exact speed of understanding. Returns bloom and fade on the scope, and the pencil scratches, while a voice on headphones reads bearings. The Wildcat pilots do not need an essay. They need a vector and an altitude. He pushes the combat air patrol high because the picture is finally clean and because the last time they were low, the picture turned into smoke. He calls the heading, gets the clipped acknowledgement, and looks at the second hand, pulling toward a mark that matters for reasons no one outside the room will notice. On the Japanese side again, the D3A pilot makes landfall at a deck that is no longer his deck in the way it was this morning. Men on Hiryu work with a focus that excludes the burn on the horizon. The pilot's hands shook for the first time today while he wrote his report, and he was ashamed of that shaking until the gunner, who had never been given to speak, dropped a hand on the back of his seat without a word. The pilot hears the order to launch the next strike and knows what it means for fuel and light, and the fact that the other side has not been cowed by a clean hit. He rolls his shoulders, pulls his straps, and goes again, because going again is the only answer a crew has ever had. A zero-section leader finally finds the altitude he wanted 20 minutes ago and sees the ocean as a map instead of a tunnel. The map is wrong. The geometry he has drilled does not include 3 plumes and a lone deck that now must make 4 lifts, where 4 made 1. His hands are steady on the stick. His voice is even on the set. He calls a climb to the sun, a bearing, a speed that makes sense on paper. He also knows he is writing with chalk on a wall that is already warmed by a fire someone else lit. In the American formation straggling home, a pilot who missed his release window rides the quiet shame of it and hides inside procedure. He keeps station to the inch. He watches temperatures and pressures as if that will erase the moment when the target slides away. He counts the columns and does not let his eyes stay on any one of them. Another pilot whose bomb struck where it should sit behind his sight again in his head and feels no triumph, only a careful curiosity about whether the fuse delay matched the height. He wants to know if the elevator blown or the trunk burned, because that answer means the next attack can be tuned tighter. On Yorktown, the host team leader wipes sweat from his eyes with a dirty sleeve and laughs once a dry, fast sound that belongs to no joke. A runner brings word that steam is back and flight ops can resume if the deck holds true into the wind. Men who were just now dragging a line to an ember turn and dragging chocks instead. A door is dogged shut on a compartment that will not be saved. The petty officer signs a chalk mark on the bulkhead with his initials because someone told him once that matters later. He would prefer a cold drink and a deck that stands still. He gets another alarm and a ship that bends but keeps breathing. The talker in the plot room watches two scratches converge at the right angle and feels a small private satisfaction that is not pride. The fighters he sent high will be where they are supposed to be when the next specks appear. He doesn't see the dogfights and doesn't need to. He checks the clock, moves a marker, and repeats a bearing in the same flat voice. When the returns vanish with the right timing, he lets himself exhale. Then he takes the next call. By late afternoon, the air is a mix of heat ripples and fuel exhaust, and the taste of powder that creeps into every mouth. The D3A crew that came back goes out again knowing the odds are worse. The Zero leader holds a patrol that will end in fuel calculations rather than tallies. McCluskey's pilots land with fuel that frightens them only after the wheels are on deck and the brain has space for fear. Richard Best walks from his airplane without a cheer because the thing he needs is a debrief and a piece of paper to draw on. Down below, a sailor coils a hose he will uncoil in 10 minutes and thinks of nothing greater than where the nozzle needs to be when it matters. Competence meets compression everywhere you look. Some men discovered that the cadence they trained is too slow for a day when the enemy repairs and relaunches inside the same hour. Others find that grief can be counted and placed aside until the ship is steady into the wind. No one controls the columns of smoke except the bombs that start them and the firefighters who decide how big they will become before the sea wins. The lesson that settles over the water is not heard from any cockpit. It rides in clipped acknowledgments and chalk marks, and the steady turn of a carrier that still has enough steam to point her deck into the wind. Doctrine collided with method, the moment information became the main weapon. Chester Nimitz chose to fight on what Edwin Layton and the HYPO team could read, rather than what maps insisted. That choice put Raymond Spruance with Enterprise and Hornet, and Frank Jack Fletcher with the battered Yorktown northeast of Midway, before Chuichi Nagumo expected them. The American side did not wait for a perfect picture. It acts on a good enough one reasoning, that timing would never again be as favorable as the hour when Japanese decks were committed to rearming for a second blow against the atoll. The Japanese side brought 4 carriers, veteran air crews, and a doctrine that promised annihilation in one set piece. That promise depends on a flawless first act and smooth transitions between arming to attack and circling to defend. The day offered neither. The command decisions that shaped the hour were made in rooms far from the bomb splashes. Fletcher accepted Yorktown as a fighting deck, despite damage that surveyors thought would take weeks to remedy. Nimitz compressed that into roughly 72 hours, by turning Pearl Harbor into a factory that ran without darkness, welders, riggers, and electricians finishing jobs, even as the ship steamed out. Spruance chose to launch on probability, rather than wait to knit every squadron into a single strike, preserving the dive bomber's altitude instead of wasting fuel on a tidy rendezvous. On the other side, Nagumo's staff wrestled with rearming strike aircraft for a second attack on Midway, while reports of American carriers bled in. The delay of Tone No, Force Scout Report, and the decision to cycle from land attack ordnance to anti-ship loads put time on the enemy's side. Each choice was rational inside its doctrine. Together they became a trap. Industrial tempo and shipboard culture decided what happened after contact. American carriers had drilled damage control as a survival language. Flash-tight fittings dogged without waiting for orders, hoses run and shoring built, while the ship still shuddered from impact, boiler steam restored, so that flight operations could resume on the same heading that brought the enemy into reach. Yorktown's crew did all of that between Hiryu's counterstrikes, recovering aircraft relighting, and turning into the wind as if the ship were not bleeding from torpedoes and bombs. Japanese carriers were optimized to move large fueled strikes fast. That optimization placed lines of armed aircraft and stores in hangars that became chimneys when bombs with delayed fuses punched through planking and detonated below. Fire mains and sprinklers worked until they did not. Once multiple hits vented into galleries, sortie generation collapsed from cadence to zero. Training pipelines and replacement math briefly hid inside tactics and then stepped into the open. Japanese air groups were cohesive and elite. Their edge came from years of concentrated preparation and shared flying. Coral Sea had already torn at that edge by damaging Shokaku's flight deck and scattering Zuikaku's trained air group, leaving both carriers absent in June. The Americans paid in ships and squadrons too. Lexington lost torpedo squadrons mauled, but the pipeline to replace pilots and restore deck crews had already been set into motion. That difference did not win Midway by itself. It meant the American side could accept bleeding torpedo runs to pull the combat air patrol low and still have enough trained hands to execute the dive attack that mattered. Technology mattered only as it was used. Radar and fighter direction did not shoot down aircraft. They put wildcats in the right sky to contest a forming strike and to keep escort fighters from being everywhere at once. Dive weapons meant little until sights were steadied through buffet and fuses were set to detonate beneath the surface. Torpedoes made claims on paper. In the air, they made different claims with blood. Type 91 warheads ran shallow and were clever in water, but the B-5N that carried them had to survive a straight-line approach into radar-cued fire, and fighters arriving on vectors, not chance. Early in the war, the American Mark 13 was temperamental in the water, but its existence gave the American plan a tool to shape the fight in the vertical. Every torpedo run that could not be ignored was a hand pulling zeros downward away. From the altitudes where dive groups needed a clear path, the technical leader becomes moral only when measured against survival. On that ledger, delayed fuses and radar vectors paid out when they were married to discipline. Availability sets the board before any pilot sees a target. On the morning of June 4, the United States brought 3 carriers. Japan brought 4 down from 6 because of Coral Sea. Minutes after Wade McCluskey turned on a destroyer's wake and led his SBDs into dives, 3 Japanese decks were no longer flight decks in any meaningful sense. That 5-minute window has been summarized so often, it risks sounding like inevitability. It was the opposite. It came from a chain code breaking that put the ambush carriers where was possible to a repair surge that returned Yorktown to sea. A launch decision that accepted imperfect mass to preserve altitude and torpedo attacks that ruined the Yesterday. Enemies capped geometry, even as they were destroyed. When the bombs hit, they did not destroy doctrine. They exposed which doctrine had planned for what would happen when a perfect script broke. Human roles anchored every abstraction. On the American side, Nimitz trusted Layton's reading of traffic and backed it with steel. Spruance tolerated ambiguity to capture timing. Fletcher fights his ship back into relevance. McCluskey and Richard Best converted a hunch and a sight picture into detonations in the spaces that mattered. Damage control assistance on Yorktown made steam without speeches. On the Japanese side, Isoroku Yamamoto built a concept that depends on synchronized blows. Nagumo manages the intolerable trade between finishing Midway and guarding against carriers that might be ghosts. Staff Officer Ryunosuke Kusaka shaped options that looked precise in planning and messy in the wind. Tamon Yamaguchi launched clean counterstrikes from Hiryu and stayed when staying meant the end. None of these choices or actions were foolish. They were consistent with the scripts that produced them. Counterfactual edges stay inside the hour and illustrate the same collision. If Shokaku and Zuikaku had been presented, more decks would have absorbed the shock, and additional air groups would have disputed altitude, but the code-breaking and repair-driven timing problem would still stand. More carriers also mean more hangar fuel and ordnance exposed to a surprise dive window. If Yorktown had remained in dock, the geometry around 1020 changes. 1 fewer deck to divert strikes, and 1 fewer group to cross in from another bearing. Yet the American plan still aims to turn information into a brief, violent advantage. If cap altitude had held high in the face of torpedo reports, the dive groups would have faced thicker opposition. Holding high is a choice commanders rarely make when low threats are minutes from the beam. If rearm cycles had been cut short, earlier Japanese decks would have been cleaned, but those decks were already committed to a second strike that had to be generated fast to maintain pressure. Every alternative sharpens the rule rather than blurring it. What emerged over Midway was not a miracle of fortune, but a system outpacing a script. Information placed carriers where they could hurt first. Industry and repair tempo returned a damaged deck to relevance when models said it would be absent. A launch decision privileged timing over deadlines. Strike composition accepted ruin in one axis to create advantage in another. Damage control translated survival into continued operations in the same hour, not the next day. Across the line, a doctrine built on the beauty of a decisive day found that beauty cannot breathe in a hangar full of gasoline mist when delayed fuses and gravity do their work. Strategy sketches a decision day. Only the fleet that can repair inside the hour delivers it. The fracture begins as a timing error, not a thunderclap. Combat air patrol is busy low, dragged there by torpedo reports that no commander can ignore, and the high sky belongs to a formation that has not spent its altitude on a tidy rendezvous. Dive breaks, open reticles settle, and in the space of a few heartbeats, 3 flight decks become furnaces. Kaga takes a string of hits that cut through planking and vents into hangars where fueled aircraft wait. Akagi absorbs a single correctly placed bomb that galleries into a pressure of flame no sprinkler can match. Soryu takes blows that break her rhythm at the elevators and along fuel trunks. The synchronized striking arm that defines the First Air Fleet is not destroyed by argument. It is pulled apart by gravity, gasoline, and minutes. The first symptom of collapse is silence on radio circuits where coordination used to live. Signals that would have set timing now serve fire control and evacuate. On surviving decks, handlers move aircraft by hand where tractors are used tow because power is out along sections of the hangar. Hose teams fight along lines that were designed for accidents, not for multiple hits that open new drafts of air every time a door is dogged shut. Sortie sheets that were supposed to be tight columns of times and numbers smear into a list of what cannot launch. A planned second blow becomes a series of local attempts to restore order. Hiryu stands alone against that math for a few hours. Tamon Yamaguchi does not wait for a perfect picture. He knows there is one deck available and acts as if speed can substitute for mass. The first counterstrike finds Yorktown, and bombs fall into the rectangle that has been turning into the wind all morning. The ship loses way, regains it under a flurry of clipped orders, and recovers aircraft again as steam comes back. Damage control on the American carrier works with a cadence that belongs to habit rather than inspiration. When a second wave from Hiryu arrives, torpedoes bite, and list follows. Still, in the intervals between alarms, hoses run shoring, goes up, and aircraft land on a deck that refuses to concede its function. The fight is not a duel between ships. It is a contest between a fleet that can keep a platform breathing inside the hour and a fleet that needs intact hangars to deliver another synchronized punch. Altitude control resets on the American side as radar and fighter direction push the Wildcats back into the high sky in time to interfere with any fresh formation. The picture is never clean for long, but it is clean long enough. Japanese fighters, already thinned and scattered by earlier demands, arrive late to screens they would once have dominated. Replacement for losses is no longer a theory. It is a deficit, counted squadron by squadron, as leaders call for wingmen who do not answer. On the burning carriers, crew chiefs call rolls that return too few voices. On the American decks, head counts also shrink, but the machines keep turning into the wind, and the next wave forms without speeches. Through early afternoon, the horizon holds steady black pillars where wakes used to draw neat curves. Each column marks a deck that cannot generate sorties. Elevators jammed in mid-travel become chimneys. Aft sections that were control points an hour ago become boundaries no one can cross. Every attempt to respot aircraft takes men the fire teams need. Every decision to vent smoke opens air to flame somewhere else. The calculation that once asked how many aircraft could be launched in 10 minutes now asks how many minutes a bulkhead can hold. Hiryu's independence has an arc measured in launches. Yamaguchi sends what he can when he can, understanding that the only way to restore initiative is to keep the enemy's flight decks occupied. His strikes are proof of residual skill. They do not have a backpath to carry mass. When Hiryu herself is found and struck, the day's logic closes around the last intact deck. Fires go down through places where control cables used to run. Pumps lose head when lines are ruptured by heat. The question shifts from whether another strike can be prepared to how and when to abandon ships whose names will still be spoken with respect. The myth that pre-war doctrine protected is not shattered by insult. It bends under specific pressures that the doctrine did not account for. The decisive battle assumes a perfect opening and an enemy that cannot answer before the second act begins. Intelligence-led positioning nullifies the first assumption. The ability to repair inside the hour nullifies the second. The first air fleet's power was always in synchrony. That synchrony cannot be rebuilt by will once fire and blast separate decks from hangars and sever the lines that turn a carrier from a hull into a weapon. A single operational deck can hurt the enemy, as Hiryu proves, but it cannot reassemble a broken arm while the opponent keeps striking into the gaps. Evening decisions make the new reality explicit. Orders to prepare for scuttling are not brave lines in a story. They are a recognition that the fuel, water, and firefighting capacity required to save hulls no longer exists. Officers concentrate on saving crews and on removing codebooks and instruments the enemy must not recover. Boats go over in water that gleams with oil. Men who have served together for years climb down nets from islands washed by flame. Signals to accompany these movements are precise and stripped of romance. North of Midway, the American side does not celebrate. Yorktown is crippled and will not live to escort the next advance, although her people do not know it yet. Enterprise and Hornet remain decks that can accept aircraft and push them back into the air. The change in initiative is not a headline. It is a practical list of what can sail forward with planes and trained crews aboard and what must withdraw. The radar plots dim their lights for night operations. Fighter direction rooms grow quiet, except for an occasional bearing. On damaged Japanese ships, the light is orange, and moving a color no mariner wants to see at dusk. At the level of minutes, the collapse of the myth is captured by numbers anyone can count. 3 carriers are disabled in roughly 5 minutes. 2 counterstrikes from the remaining deck hit and hurt an enemy carrier, but the follow-through dissolves with the deck that launched them. Sortie generation drops from rotation to almost nothing when fires breach hangars. Combat air patrol cohesion breaks when altitude demands cannot be met and fuel times drive decisions. None of these measures require grand claims. They describe a doctrine's limits under a specific stress. Night arrives with the sea lit by lines of flame that drift in oil. Some ships will be finished by torpedoes put into them by their own people. Some will settle after crews are taken off. The names will be recorded with care and anger. In the morning, the ocean will be littered with lifeboats and the outlines of tasks no staff officer can complete without carriers that no longer exists. On the American side, engines turn easily, and decks smell of exhaust and wet canvas. Procedures continue, because procedures are how a force that has not finished anything still avoids losing what it has won. Pearl Harbor wrote the opening shock. The events north of Midway write its limit. The idea that a flawless first act could carry the day meets an opponent that answers before the second act begins and keeps answering even after being hit. The carriers that burned did not lose to fortune. They lost to timing, altitude, and a repaired culture that refused to pause. The columns of smoke that mark the afternoon mark the boundary between aura and outcome, and no signal can order them back into decks. Afternoon light fades north of Midway, with 3 columns fixed on the horizon and a 4th that will rise tomorrow. Kaga, Akagi, and Soryu are already past saving on June 4. Hiryu will be found and struck on 5 June after launching the last clean counterblows of the day. Boats move through oil codebooks, go over the side, and crews transfer under a sky that still smells of hot paint. The first air fleet's synchronized punch ends not with a single order, but with the absence of functioning decks. The operational question is no longer who scored first. It is who can still plan, launch, and recover tomorrow. On the American side, Enterprise and Hornet remain flight decks that turn into the wind. Yorktown is a separate story, written in tight chapters, bombs, and torpedoes on June 4. Steam, restored aircraft, recovered, then fresh damage that leaves her dead in the water. Salvage crews come aboard with pumps and optimism. Destroyers pass lines. The ocean looks briefly cooperative. A Japanese submarine will put torpedoes into the cluster on June 6, and the carrier will finally roll and sink on June 7. The loss is immediate and hard, yet it sits within a frame that now favors scheduling and concentration. Midway is held. The fleet that can still mass aircraft by the next sunrise has initiative. The operational board shifts faster than any narrative summary. Japan's carrier arm no longer exists as a coherent mass. Surviving pilots and deck crews are redistributed into ships that cannot replace the lost flight decks. Training squadrons that fed elite air groups before the war cannot match combat attrition once 4 carriers are gone in 2 days. The United States has 2 intact decks on scene and more training throughput already in motion. Radar-directed fighter control has earned confidence, and damage control has proven it can keep a wounded platform alive long enough to matter. The difference is not a slogan. It is a planning calendar. By late June, staff work on both sides is an exercise in stressful constraints. Isoroku Yamamoto accounts for the ships and air crews no longer available and orders withdrawals that preserve surface forces. Tamon Yamaguchi's name moves from orders of the day to casual roles. Chester Nimitz writes tasking that assumes Enterprise and Hornet can press forward while new crews graduate and fresh aircraft arrive. Debriefs from Enterprise and Hornet air groups are spare, technical and focused on what can be tightened, sight picture fuse settings, rendezvous discipline fighter vectors. Yorktown's story continues in paperwork that credits her crew for a ship that kept breathing long enough to trap the enemy into launching alone. The title's 6-month claim holds its shape when expressed as procedure. Shock opened the campaign in December. The answer, 6 months later, is a chain that proves it can function under impact. Read the enemy's plan, place decks on the flank, accept imperfect mass to preserve altitude and timing, absorb the counterblow, restore steam strike. Again, the decision battle myth does not need refutation in prose. It met conditions it was not built to survive. Rearm cycles overlapped with sudden defense hangars staged for momentum became chimneys, and a single remaining deck could not restore a shattered rhythm while an opponent kept generating attacks on schedule. 3 narrow questions linger for planners rather than storytellers. If Shokaku and Zuikaku had been present, extra decks and air groups would have complicated the 5-minute window, but the code-breaking and positioning problem would still stand, and more fueled hangars could also mean more hazardous volume at the wrong minute. If Yorktown had remained in dock, one axis of attack disappears, and the geometry around Soryu changes. Even then, the American plan still aims to turn information into a brief altitude advantage and to spend torpedo squadrons to buy it. If combat air patrol had held high in defiance of torpedo reports, dive losses increased. Yet that choice asks commanders to accept a beam threat minutes from impact while betting against an unseen dive threat. An inversion doctrine rarely permits in the moment. The next arc follows the same quiet logic. Submarines tighten pressure on shipping lines, while code breaking keeps the pattern legible. Radar and fighter direction mature into night work that denies safety after sunset. Replacement pipelines thicken until trained crews arrive in numbers that turn air group losses from strategic shocks into problems of scheduling and maintenance. The lesson from Midway is not a celebration. It is a procedure proven under stress and ready to be repeated with more hulls, more aircraft, and crews drilled to the same cadence. Shock can open a campaign. It cannot maintain one. The afternoon north of Midway ends with smoke replacing wakes and a blunt inventory of what still flies. From that inventory comes the only legacy that matters to staff officers. Planning the next operation, place the decks where information says the enemy must pass. Keep altitude for the window that counts. Trust damage control to buy back our minutes and prepare to launch on time again.